Ladies and gentlemen, episode 17, Risk It for the Biscuit podcast. It is another Monday, and we're back at it this morning. Got another person, another individual in the Bible we're going to be talking about who took great big risks. Before we just jump into it, I hope you guys had an awesome, phenomenal week last week. And I'm excited for today's episode. Last week was my first week officially being done with school forever, and it was pretty cool. Although I did skip my graduation and whatnot, I had a different thing that I went to. Friends got married down in Florida, so we went down there, and then went on a little vacation trip afterwards, and I honestly forgot how much I missed the beach. I don't really like the beach, but being down there with friends was an awesome time, and so I was excited to do that as well as not have to be in school. I now realize it's going to take a little bit of time to adjust to being a normal civilian, normal citizen, and just doing normal people stuff. Because although I hated due dates and homeworks and assignments, I do now realize that it kind of kept me in a structure, I guess, and kept me in a routine. And so now we're going to have to live life. And so that's exciting. I'm definitely not complaining about that. But yeah, with all that being said, I do want to talk about actually, there's one more thing. This past weekend, I've been, of course, I am keeping up with Ukraine all the time, but it seems like they're making some positive progress over on the fronts. So praise God for that. It's good to see. Yes, in the Bakhmut area, it's like the first time I remember they're tweeting, first time in months where the deep state map with they like show the progress. It's being updated, and so that's for sure cool to see, especially when you have friends and family right there, right down the street. Like when you're looking at the map, it's a wild experience. But just wanted to touch on that real quick. But honestly, let's see. Current events. Every time I go on vacation, I realize, or I just, I'm out of town and I'm hanging out with friends, and I realize that I'm not really focused on the news. I don't keep up with current events as much. And I actually like that a lot better, to be honest. Although that kind of is the goal of this whole podcast, is to talk about current events, recent news, as well as, taking risks. But I do like not knowing as much, I guess. But anyway, so no current events today, not this week. We're going to talk about Joshua in the Bible. And I feel like I say this all the time, especially when I preach, but the Bible is so incredible, to be honest. Like, it's so good, and I wish I emphasized and prioritized reading it more than I do. And although I do read pretty much every day, there's just so much to like really just dive into, and like, there's so many things that like relate and correlate, and like this is related to that, and there's so many of those things, and just the history, between the families and it's just incredible. Okay. I feel like if it's better than any Netflix series, it's more interesting than like, I mean, think about it. People, and I mean, I don't really spend as much time doing this, but there's people that spend so much time learning about like fake universes, right? Like there's whole like cult followings learning about like Marvel and the little Easter eggs and all the hidden messages inside of it, and like Marvel, like Harry Potter, whatever, Star Wars, all these things, they're not even real, they're just like fictional, like made up stuff, and we spend time, researching it and figuring it out, and the meanings behind the little things. But man, the Bible is second to none in that aspect. There's so much stuff to uncover, and the stuff that you do uncover, it gives you like revelation, and it helps you live your life, not just, it's not just interesting, it also helps you live your life. And it's just so incredible, man. And I say that because every time I bring up a Bible character, I'll say, oh, this is my favorite Bible character. But like when I think about Joshua, man, he is so like cool. You know what I mean? His story is so cool. His life is so cool. It's so interesting, fascinating how like these people were able to do what they did, how God used them, God's relationship with them. I feel like it's so inspiring, and I feel like I say that about every single Bible character, because like as soon as you start reading about it, and of course maybe I don't understand the Bible, if you just grab it and start reading it, things can seem confusing, complicated. Um, it's just like, okay, these are random things, right? But you got to study it, man. You got to, look up sources. Hey, what does this word mean? And like, oh, and that too in the Bible. Names mean so many things. You got to, look at commentaries, cross-reference things, and then when you start really diving into it, it's so cool. So cool. And so today I wanted to talk about Joshua. And he is very fascinating. His life is very interesting. Um, the things that he was able to accomplish for Israel, for the people of God, was fascinating. And in my eyes, like many in the Bible, he's a man of faith, and faith doesn't come without risk. That's one thing that I've been thinking about, especially this past week as I was getting ready for this episode. In order to live out faith, you have to take risk. That's just how it is, right? The Bible says faith without works, or faith without action, is dead. So in order to take a step of faith, you have to make a risk. Everybody in the Bible, I just got to sneeze. Oh my goodness. We'll see. Anyway, all the people in the Bible, all the people of faith, they've taken risks, right? Peter, to walk on water, had to take a risk. Oh my goodness, dude. Excuse me. He had to take a risk. Man, it keeps throwing me off. Peter in the Bible had to take a risk in order to activate his faith. It's a risk. Everybody in the Bible had to take a risk. Or the people of faith, right? Or the people who you see who have great faith, or even little faith. I just thought about Zacchaeus, right? He had to take a risk of climbing a tree. Short guy climbing a tree. But anyway, we're talking about Joshua today. So check this out. Joshua, if you don't know Joshua, a little bit of history on him. He was the successor of Moses as the leader of Israel. So God calls Moses, from whatever he was doing. He says, I've heard the cry of my people. I want to free them from Egypt, from slavery, from Pharaoh, and you're going to be the guy to do it. That's what God tells Moses. If we know Moses, makes excuses or whatever. Actually, Moses is another person we can talk about taking risks, but that's for a different episode. Moses, says, I can't. I have a speech impediment. I can't talk. Blah blah blah. Like God says, I'm going to use you, and don't worry about it. It's going to be fine. We're going to deliver the people of Israel from slavery, from their oppression. So Moses does that. He takes them out into the wilderness. He's supposed to take them into the promised land. They had some bumps along the way. And there was one moment in the wilderness, in the desert, where Moses doesn't obey God, and God says, you're not going to enter the promised land. And so the person that leads Israel into the promised land is Joshua. After Moses dies, or right before Moses dies, Moses kind of anoints him and calls him to be the next leader of Israel. And so he is the guy that carries the torch forward. It says he was born in Egypt, right? So he was from that generation that Moses helped deliver from Egypt. And Joshua doesn't become the successor to Moses, the leader of Israel, by accident. That's the interesting thing. He took some risks to get there. And the first thing that I feel like Joshua does or the first risk that he takes, if you read, it says that, and I don't exactly remember where this says, but Joshua would linger in God's presence. So we know the story of Moses and the Israelites in the wilderness. God would speak to Moses face to face, right? God gave the people of Israel all these instructions, the tent of meeting, right? There was a place where God's presence would come down on this designated place, and he would speak to Moses, give him instructions, things like that. And Joshua, being Moses' assistant, the Bible says he would linger. So Moses would pray. He would have his time with God. And I don't know exactly how this happened. I don't think the Bible mentions it, but it would just say, and I don't think Joshua was even allowed, into the place where God was, because there's many different, places outside of the actual, the place where God's presence, was. There's like levels to it, I guess, if I'm getting this correct. If I'm not, you can obviously, write in the comments. But I'm not a Bible theologian. I just read the Bible, and this is how I'm interpreting it, or how I remember it. And so it says Joshua would linger behind. Moses would have his time and head on out to do his stuff, but Joshua would linger behind. I think Joshua saw that whenever Moses was in God's presence, he was changed. He saw the effect of being in God's presence. The Bible talks about how when Moses came back from the mountain of receiving the Ten Commandments, his face was literally shining, and the people told him to cover his face because they couldn't look at him. And so I think Joshua observed all this stuff and said, man, I don't really know exactly what all this is, but I've got to be in that same presence. I've got to be in that same room. There's something special about being in that presence, in the presence of God. And Joshua valued this. But what we also know from the Old Testament is that unlike we have today, where we can just enter into the presence of God, in the Old Testament, only special people at special times, after special processes, were allowed into the presence of God. The priests had to go through like cleansing, and they had to go through, rituals in order, like animals had to be sacrificed in a certain order. Atonement had to be made in order to enter into the presence of God. And it was such a big deal to enter into the presence of God. Because if you weren't in right standing with God, you would die. There were many examples also. People would, I believe God, his presence descended on Mount Sinai, if I'm not mistaken. And I think someone, or like it was either an animal, or a person. They either, I think that maybe the animal like walked onto the mountain, or a person touched the side of the mountain and they died. So the presence of God was, powerful, and it was pretty dangerous for people who weren't in right standing with him. It was so important and so strict also that whenever the priests would go in to go into the presence of God, they had a cord, I believe, wrapped around their foot, and on their garments there was a lot of jewelry, and I believe there was bells dangling from their jewelry, right? So because there was a curtain, and the priest would have to go, behind the curtain into the Holy of Holies, and they would, pray there. If I'm understanding this all correctly, I'm kind of just speaking from memory. But if they weren't in right standing with God, then they would drop dead. God would just kill them, and the people, from behind the curtain would listen. If the bells ever stopped, if the dangling of the jewelry ever stopped, they'd know that they were dead, and they'd pull them out by the foot. They wouldn't dare even enter. That's how serious the presence of God was. And I'm saying all of this. To say that Joshua took a risk in lingering in the presence of God. That's how I see it. He took a risk. From one angle, you could say, what makes you think, if you, knowing all that you know, Joshua, what makes you think that God wanted you in his presence at that time? God was hanging out with Moses, right? I think that's where they say the whole thing of coming into God's presence with awe and trembling, because his presence is so holy, right? But yeah, so Joshua, what makes you think that you could just enter into the presence of God? I see that as a risk. If there was any point where God was unhappy with Joshua, or Joshua was not in the right standing with God, could have been struck dead, I feel like. But Joshua's boldness to say, I see what the presence of God is doing for Moses, how his life is changing. Remember, Moses was very timid. He was not confident in himself. And this is the thing you see many, many times in the Bible. And even with people who get saved today, you see it. People who are timid, self-conscious, insecure. I was like that too. When you encounter God's presence and God's presence gets on the inside of you, it completely transforms you. And so I believe Joshua sees that. I don't know how close he was to Moses. Maybe he saw him from a distance initially, but maybe, he was obviously his assistant. So he was closer to him later on. But I believe Joshua was observing, hey, Moses is changing right before my eyes, and the secret must be in that tent of meeting, in the meeting tent. That must be the secret. It must be the presence. And he said, I know maybe I wasn't invited. Maybe I don't have an invitation into this. But if that's the secret, if that's the thing making the difference, I gotta be in this presence. And I think that's a risk. I think that's the first risk we see Joshua take. Next, I see that Joshua takes the risk of exploring the land. Now, I don't know if this is 100% accurate. Let me see. Okay, maybe he was called. Yeah, he was one of the 12 sent. He was one of the 12 sent to go explore the land. So basically, the Israelites get up to the promised land. They're right on the border, I guess. God's about to take them in. And they send 12 spies to go check out the land. Joshua was one of them. That was a risk, right? And I don't know if he was in a position to deny, to say, no, I'm good. I'm sure he could have if he was scared or if he didn't want to. But, I mean, being a spy is a risk. In a land you don't know, in around a people you don't know. Even right now in the war in Ukraine and in other wars, being a spy was always a risk. You're finding out secrets. You're finding out your enemy's strategies. And if you get caught, it's a big risk. You're risking your life. You're risking torture. And so, but I see that Joshua's not afraid to take this risk his own life to do the work of God, pretty much. He risks his life being killed as a spy. And the risk doesn't stop here for Joshua, because when he comes back, they have to give a report. And what they see in this land is essentially they discover that there's giants in this land. People who are literally like enormous. They said they were huge. There's giants. I think one of the pieces of evidence that they bring back is they brought back a cluster of grapes, but it was so big they had to carry it on a pole between two people, if I'm not mistaken. Again, I need to probably make sure I'm not mistaken. But anyway, so they come back with that, and the 10 spies, there's 2 spies that says, God is with us, he's given us this land, let's go get it. Right? 2 people, Joshua and Caleb. The other 10 guys said, no, the giants are too big, we'll get killed trying to take this land. Let's just not. And from one side, it's like, yeah, well, God told them this is the promised land. They should have just believed it. They should have just, accepted it. Yeah, well, what about the promised land where God says you can be free from anxiety, free from depression, free from addiction? That's your promised land as well. But how many times do we say, no, that's too big of a giant? It takes risk to believe in that. And it takes risk to say, no, this is our promised land. We can defeat these giants. If God is for us, who can be against us, right? And so Joshua is one of the 2 people who takes the risks of saying, no, this is our promised land. Yes, the giants are there, but maybe let's not focus on the giants. Let's focus on God. Come on. And he takes the risk. I think that's a risk. Why is this a risk? I think he risks embarrassment from his peers. He risks being shunned, right? Because if the overall opinion is no, we can't take this land, but he says, no, yeah, we can, we got this. It says he was only one of 2 people. He's going against the majority. How easy would it have been to be like, oh, yeah. They're all saying, no, we're scared. And Joshua could have been, okay, yeah. Is it worth, taking that stand? Is it worth voicing your opinion when you're outnumbered like that? I wonder if this affected his relationship with his family, right? With his friends. It was a risk. I think it's a risk because if the majority is saying no, we're going to lose, but he stands firm on the fact that no, we can take this land. God's given us victory. They say they went with his and Caleb's report, but they go into the land and lose, and people die. Then you're looking to Caleb and Joshua to kind of blame them for that, right? It's a risk putting your name on something like that. It's a risk. But it turns out this risk was worth it. Because once God sees that the other 10 spies were scared, they pretty much talked Moses out of going, out of fighting. God gets angry and says, this whole generation is going to die off in the wilderness before we enter the promised land. And because Joshua gave a good report, because Joshua took the risk of saying, no, this is our land, God's given it to us, his life is spared. Now, taking risk, having faith, maybe there's a correlation there between being in the presence and being confident enough to take those steps of faith, to take those risks. I think, I've been saying on this whole thing, episode, or this whole podcast, faith and risk, I feel like are very closely associated. But maybe those other 10 guys didn't linger in the presence. Now that's a different topic, kind of a different, I guess, sermon, if you will. But those other 10 guys didn't linger in the presence. Joshua did. I don't know about Caleb. Can't say about Caleb. Don't remember about Caleb. Makes a difference. He takes the risk. God said, but taking that risk spares his life. As a result of Joshua taking these risks, being bold, having faith, as we spoke about earlier, he becomes the successor to Moses. He becomes the next leader of Israel. Once Moses dies, Joshua is the one to lead the people of Israel into the promised land, into Canaan. That in itself was also a risk, leading the people into Canaan, right? There was battles that had to be fought. Lives are lost in battles. Lives are lost in war. It's a risk. But God said, I've given you this land. I will give you the victory. You got to go. God can give you the victory, but if you don't act on it, right? I have a good friend who always says, every day we wake up with $1 million check. Grace, of mercy, grace that helps us overcome the things that we struggle with, grace that helps us overcome temptation, guilt, shame, condemnation. But do we cash that check? It's a risk. It's a risk. Going into battle is a risk, Joshua. But he takes that risk. Let's see. And as a result of him taking risks, what happens? He enters the promised land, conquers Jericho. By the end of his life, he defeated 6 kings in the area, in the region. God gave him victory. He had God's favor on his life. He's looked back on by many historians as an Old Testament Jesus figure, as a savior. He accomplished many things. He had many great successes in his life. He risked it for the biscuit. He took a risk. He took a step of faith. And I know this podcast is just a broad, I guess, conversations about risks. But I think risk and faith are right there, neck and neck, correlated. And I think the question especially when I read in the Bible about people of faith that took risks, is what risk or what step of faith am I supposed to be taking? Right? And so I want to encourage you with that this week. As you're reading your Bible, don't just read it as, what's the risk here? What's the faith here? What's the step of faith here? And what steps of faith is God looking for me to take? And like Joshua, don't forget to linger in the presence. Don't forget to prioritize the presence. That's the secret, I feel like. But yeah, that's it for this week. Hopefully next week we'll have our co-host and talk to him about risk and about his risks and his outlook on all this stuff. But that's it. Thank you guys for watching. If you do me a favor, like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Hope you guys have a blessed week, awesome week. And we'll see you next Monday. Peace.